So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to go over the various selection techniques that we covered in class. And specifically, we're going to go over the select by attributes, the select by location, and select by graphics. And we'll go over each of those in turn. But specifically, the select by attributes is one where we select based on a characteristic of the observation, or it's data based. The attributes is the first example. And so what we're going to see here is that we're going to select observations that meet certain criteria based on characteristics that we find in the attribute table. And so the way that this works is we are going to make use of the data files that we are familiar with. For Gotham, we have the school points. We also have the repeated calls for service data, again, which is available on Canvas. And we have the census tracts for this area. The way the process works is we are going to click on the selection tab, and you'll see there are two options that are black, which means we can select them, and one that is grayed out. So first we'll go to select by attributes. The way that this works is we're going to have to make a couple of selections. First, we are going to choose observations that are in the calls for service data. And you'll see there's this little window down here where we are going to select here, create a new layout. The next option is we are going to select the calls for service. And what we're going to be looking for is we want to select all observations that have 8 or more calls for service. So the way we do that is we select the calls for service variable, and we choose greater or equal than, and then 8. When we click the verify button, as we just did, that will tell us if there's a syntax error in our query statement, and it won't tell us if the actual selection is correct. If we get a correct verification and we click OK, you'll see now that we have these blue points highlighted. These are all of the values that were selected. And when we open up the attribute table for the calls for service, you'll see that there are 120 out of roughly 12,000 calls for service that had 8 or more observations, or 8 or more times calls for service went to that location. Once we have selected these items, in order to not have to deal with only the ones that we selected, we will right click on the layer and then go down to selection and then create layer from selected attributes. And then we're going to go up and we're going to clear all of the selected features. This is just a good idea to make sure that there are no ongoing selected items. The next thing that we do here is we can go in and we now have a layer that is a temporary layer that includes just the 120 observations with 8 or more calls for service. And if we look at the identify tool and we click on a number of these, we should see that all of them have at least 8, as they should. So one thing to keep in mind is that the selection layer is a temporary layer, and we can open up the attribute table and do a frequency, look at the distribution a little more closely, and you see that it has a minimum of 8, and it goes all the way, the count goes all the way up to 97, as it should. So that is the select by attributes. Again, the idea here is that the selection is based on a characteristic of the observation, not based on location. There's no information about location that is of interest to us. We just want to know, in this case, items that have, or observations that have multiple calls for service. Okay, so in the next part of the video, we're going to make a different kind of selection. This time we're going to select based on the location. And so as the name suggests, this kind of selection has a spatial referent. So we will be selecting observations or a subset of observations from one of the data layers based on its location with respect to something else. And in this first example, we're going to measure distances from schools. And so the way that this works is we will first, you see we open the schools, you see the little orange school icons. And what we're going to do here is we're going to go to selection again, and then you'll see this option select by location. We're going to select that. And here we're going to have to use two pieces of information. We have one is we're going to select items from, and then we have a source layer, which is the referent. So in this case, we're again going to select observations from, and we're going to choose the calls for service. Note that we don't want to choose the calls for service selection. We want the regular calls for service. And then we're going to scroll down until we see an item that is within a distance of. In this case, we are going to change this to 1,000 feet. So what we're going to do here is we are going to select all calls for service that happened within 1,000 feet of schools. And when we click OK, you see we now have these bunches of highlighted points around the schools, which we should. When we open up the attribute table, you see we have about 500, a little less than 500 of the 12,000 and change of these calls for service happened around schools. Again, in order to create a temporary layer, we'll right click on the calls for service and scroll down to selection and then create layer from selected features. We will unselect all of the selected features. And when we turn off the calls for service data, what you'll see here is that we're left with the selected items. And these are all of the calls for service that happened within 1,000 feet from schools. And what we can also do is we can measure some of these with the measuring tool. And what we will see here is that if we change this distance to feet and we measure distances across, and you'll see that we can, all of these items that show up are within the given distance of the schools. And so that's just a quick check to make sure things look correct. And when we zoom out, what we can do is we can go and we can click on this full extent so we can see the entire map. And what we're going to do now is we can perform a selection within those previously selected items. And what I mean by that is we can now combine the select by location and select by attributes. And so you see here we have all of these 475 observations that all happened within a certain distance of schools. And now we can choose from those, we can select from those items calls for service or locations that meet specific criteria. So here again, we're going to choose from those previously selected values, and then we're going to use select by attributes. And we're going to select all of those observations that again happened within a certain distance of schools for which there were 3 or more calls for service. So in a sense, we did a selection on a selection. So it's a layered selection. And you'll see here that we have a subset of the 475 observations. And we'll go through this process again where we go selection and then create layer from selected features. And then we'll clear out all of the sort of the light blue dots, the highlighted items. And when we uncheck that, we're left with just the very specific set of observations that we just chose. And you see here, we now have the same number of selected features we saw before. And when we zoom in, we now know that these are the specific observations, all of which happen not only within a certain distance of the schools, but also they had a specific number of calls for service. So what we're going to talk about now is another technique. And this technique is one where we select by graphics. And unlike the other two, this technique is one that doesn't require information about the attribute table or the location. Rather, it makes use of a user-defined area, and it can select observations that way. The way that we do this is we are going to make use of the drawing tool or the drawing toolbar, as you will see in just a sec. But what we have here is we will look at the Customize tab, and then under Toolbars, you'll scroll down and you'll see one that says Draw, and that one should be checked. When that option is selected, you'll see that there's a drawing toolbar available to us. Still, we do not have the option to select by graphics. So what we're going to do is we will select the rectangle and we will draw an area somewhere on the map that is of interest to us. And you'll see it will put this sort of yellow square rectangle in the area that we chose. We can adjust it or move it. This is just an object on the map, so we can delete it or move it. We can change the shape. There are other shape options. Lots of possibilities with this option. And so you'll see here that once we have the selection made, you'll see that there are these little blue squares around, right? It's kind of, there's a outline around the square. And this is important because this means that the square is active. And when that's the case, the select by graphics option is available. So if you get to a point where you have this rectangle or square drawn and you click and you don't see the select by graphics option, what we can do is just make sure to click on it so it has that blue highlight around it. Next, we're going to click on the table of contents and the selectable layers, and we're going to turn off all of the layers except for the calls for service. And the reason why is when we select observations, we want to select only the calls for service and not all of the associated layers. Once we've gone through that process and we go up to the selection and then select by graphics, what you'll see is that all of these points underneath the rectangle are highlighted, and this means that it was a success. We were able to select all of the options that are just below the rectangle, and what we can then do is we can move, we can create a temporary layer as we have done before, and then deselect all of the selected features so that we're focusing only on this subset of observations. And when we zoom in, we see that there are lots of observations that were within this area. And the point to keep in mind here is that whereas the other two selection procedures required information about location or a characteristic of the observation, selecting by graphics requires neither. And when we perform this kind of selection, you see that we are able to, it has a lot of flexibility for our purposes, but it doesn't have any, there's nothing substantively defined, or there's nothing substantively critical about those observations other than we selected them, in the sense that they don't have a pattern or a location that is of interest. What we're going to do now is I'm going to compare what we just did with a different kind of selection, which is one that includes polygons. And in order to do this, we're going to make use of the ganglands data. The idea here is this is very similar to the select by graphics. However, the selection is done with reference to a polygon layer that has been predefined. So the way that we do this is we're going to do a select by location. We are going to first just choose a single gang area, and so we'll choose the East Side Gorillas. And what we're doing is we're selecting by location first, or we're selecting by attributes, I'm sorry. And we're selecting the gangland or the gang area for the East Side Gorillas. And we will go and we'll create a temporary layer from that selection. And you'll see that correctly so, we have identified the East Side Gorillas gang area. So we'll go through that same process where we're going to clear out selected features, and we can even turn off all of the gang territories. So you see that we're focusing on one gang territory that we selected by attributes. And now what we're going to do is select all of the calls for service that fall within that. So here's how we do that. So we'll go to select by location again. We are going to select observations from the calls for service, and the source layer we're looking for here is the East Side Gorillas gangland. So we'll choose gang selection as the source layer, and we're going to look for contain or fall completely within the source layer. And when we click OK or apply and then OK, you'll see that we selected just observations that fall within this this particular gangland area. And when we open up the attribute table, you see that there are about 400 or so observations that fall in this area. And we'll go and create a temporary layer from those selected features. And then we'll turn off we'll clear all the selection, and then we will turn off all of the calls for service. And you'll see what we're left with is a selection that is one that was based on attributes. So we selected a gang territory based on the attributes of it, being the East Side Gorillas is the gang territory. We then selected all calls for service within those. So that was a selection by location. And what the point of that was is to illustrate how these different selection techniques can be used in combination with one another for the purposes of analysis. Thank you for watching. If you have questions, please be in touch, and happy mapping. Talk to you all soon.